My son mailed a letter to Santa on the 9th of December, and through no fault of the North Pole or any postal worker who has ever earned an honest wage, it landed on the marble desk of the coldest woman in the city. The morning it happened, I was on my knees in the sorting room of the 4th Street Annex, fishing a torn glove out from under a conveyor belt while my supervisor recited, for the 3rd time that week, everything wrong with me. Mr. Haverford had a voice like a stapler and an opinion about omegas that he considered progressive because he only said it in private. 10 minutes late. Fingers too slow for the machines. A kid at home who called twice a shift, which he timed. He liked to remind me that I was lucky to have the seasonal contract at all, given my history, given the gap on my resume where a company had once decided that an omega on maternity leave was an omega who no longer existed. I did not tell Haverford any of that. I said I was sorry, and I meant it the way you mean an apology you have made so many times it has worn a groove in your mouth. Milo did not know any of it either. He was 5, and to him I was simply his mother, and his mother's hands were cold every night when I came home, and this apparently was a problem he intended to solve directly with upper management. He had written the letter himself, in crayon, on a piece of red construction paper folded into quarters and taped shut with a snowman sticker. He would not let me read it. He said it was between him and Santa and possibly God, if God had anything to do with the mail. He walked it to the corner box himself, standing on his toes, and I watched from the window with my heart doing the thing it did every year around this time, equal parts tender and afraid, because I did not have the money this Christmas either, and I did not know how I was going to explain that to a boy who believed so completely that wanting something out loud was most of the way to getting it. What neither of us knew was that a smudge of slush had blurred the last 2 digits of our zip code, and a distracted sorter 3 towns over had matched the rest to a building downtown that received exactly 1 piece of mail addressed to the North Pole that season, and forwarded it, as a joke among tired people trying to survive December, to the desk of the one executive in the city too busy and too feared to appreciate jokes. Ria Castellan owned 4 buildings on that block, and, according to the tabloids, a temperature all her own. The papers called her the coldest woman in the city so often it had stopped being an insult and become a kind of shorthand, the way you'd say the tallest building or the deepest lake. She ran Castellan Holdings, which ran shipping lanes and toy factories, and twice a year, a toy drive gala so enormous it required its own security detail. She had not smiled in a published photograph in 3 years. Nobody remembered why. I found out how the letter had traveled the same afternoon Haverford found out, which was the worst possible order of events. He came to the sorting room holding a printed email like it might bite him, his face doing something between panic and fury. Someone at Castellan Holdings had called corporate. Someone at corporate had called the annex. The word negligence had been used, and also the word lawsuit, though nobody yet knew what exactly had been done wrong beyond a boy's letter reaching a desk it was never meant to reach. Whoever's responsible for this, Haverford said, in the tone of a man already deciding who that would be, is going to wish they'd never touched a mailbag. I did not know yet that the letter was mine, was Milo's, was ours. I only knew that his eyes had found me first, the way they always did, and that somewhere across the city a woman with a reputation for ending careers before lunch was holding my son's handwriting in her hand. The door at the end of the room opened before Haverford could finish threatening me. A man in a charcoal coat stood in it, tall, unhurried, carrying the kind of stillness that made the whole warehouse go quiet without him raising his voice. "I'm looking for whoever sent this," he said, and held up a folded square of red construction paper with a snowman sticker on it. Ms. Castellan wants to see them. Today, every eye in the room turned to me before I had even finished understanding the words. I rode the elevator to the 40th floor of Castellan Tower with Milo's hand in mine. Because Dee had a shift she couldn't drop, and because I refused to leave my son with anyone else on a day that already felt like standing on ice. He wore his good sweater, the one with the reindeer that had lost one eye, and he held my other hand like he understood, in the wordless way children do, that this mattered. The man in the charcoal coat introduced himself as Augustin Vale, Chief of Staff, and did not smile the entire ride up. He smelled faintly of cold paper and nothing else, the scent of a man who had trained himself not to have one. He watched Milo with an expression I couldn't place, somewhere between suspicion and something softer he was working hard to bury. "She doesn't usually do this," he said, like a warning. "Read personal mail. Ask for the sender. In 15 years, I've never seen her interrupt a board meeting for anything smaller than a hostile acquisition. I did not know what to do with that information, except be afraid of it." The office at the end of the hall had a wall of glass instead of a wall, and beyond it, the whole gray city sprawled out under a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to snow. The woman behind the desk did not stand when we entered. She sat with the letter open in front of her, smoothed flat despite its careful folds, and when she looked up, I understood immediately and completely why the papers had run out of softer words for her. She was beautiful in the specific way of something built to withstand weather. Dark hair pulled back with no allowance for softness, a jaw that did not know how to apologize. And under the cold recycled air of the office, when the vent above her desk pushed a current toward us, I caught it. Black spruce and cold slate. A scent like a held breath in a winter forest, sharp enough that my own instincts, dulled by years of suppressants and exhaustion, sat up and paid attention anyway. "Which one of you is Milo?" she said, and her voice was low and even, the voice of someone who had long ago decided that shouting was for people who hadn't planned ahead. My son let go of my hand and walked directly up to her enormous desk like it was a kitchen table. "Me," he said. "Did Santa forward it to you? Are you like his assistant?" Something moved behind her eyes, so briefly I almost missed it, gone before I could be sure it had been there at all. "Something like that," she said. "I read what you wrote. You weren't supposed to. It was private. It was addressed to an organization I happened to control most of the mail routes for," she said, which was, I would learn, as close as Ria Castellan ever came to admitting she'd done something soft. "I'm going to need you to explain one part of it to me." She turned the letter around. I saw my son's crayon printing, uneven and determined, and beneath a list of ordinary boyish wants, a bike, a dinosaur that roars, a friend at school who isn't mean. One line that had clearly been written slower than the rest, the letters pressed so hard they'd nearly torn the paper. "Please make my mom's hand stop hurting from the cold room she works in, and please make someone see her the way I do, because I don't think anybody else does." I felt the floor tilt very slightly under a room that had not, in fact, moved. Ria Castellan looked up from the paper to me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, someone looked at me like I was the whole sentence and not the punctuation at the end of somebody else's. "Ms. Calloway," she said. "Sit down. We have things to discuss." I did not sit so much as fold into the chair, aware of Milo climbing uninvited into the one beside it, aware of Gus Vale hovering by the door with an expression that suggested he had never once seen his employer address a stranger by name within the first minute of meeting them. The office was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the thermostat, though I couldn't yet say why. "I don't know what to say," I told her, honestly, because I had run out of the scripts I usually used for men and women who held power over my paycheck. He didn't mean to send it to you. It was an accident. A mistake in the routing, I assume. I'm aware, she said. I had someone trace it. Your zip code was smudged. A tired sorter 3 counties over matched the remaining digits to this building because we happened to receive holiday mail from the shipping contract. She said it without a trace of apology, simply facts laid in a row, though something in the set of her mouth suggested she found the whole chain of accidents almost unbearably specific. I don't intend to punish anyone for it. Behind her, on a wall screen I hadn't noticed until it flickered, columns of numbers scrolled past, live inventory counts for the toy drive warehouse, donor pledges, shipment manifests, the ordinary background noise of a company the size of a small country. I wasn't looking for anything wrong. I had trained myself out of looking for anything wrong in numbers that weren't mine to fix. But 6 years doesn't leave a person just because the job did. Your third column doesn't reconcile with your second, I said before I had decided to say anything at all. Right there. The manifest says 4,200 units shipped. The pledge total says 4,600 received. Either 300 units are sitting somewhere unaccounted for, or someone's logged the same shipment twice under 2 vendor codes. The room went very quiet. Gus Vale had straightened by the door like a man who'd heard a gunshot. Milo, delighted that his mother had said something that made grown-ups stop moving, grinned at nobody in particular. Rhea Castellan turned to look at the screen, then back at me, and for the second time that hour her expression did something it clearly did not do often. "How did you see that in 4 seconds?" she said. It was not quite a question. "I used to do this for a living," I said. Before what? Before I had a 5-year-old and a arsum gap nobody wanted to hire around. She studied me for a long moment, the kind of look that felt less like being assessed and more like being read, cover to cover, in a language I hadn't realized I still spoke fluently. "I have a mailroom position open, technically," she said. "I'm not offering you that." "What are you offering me?" "A desk on the Toy Drive audit team starting today at whatever your old salary was, plus whatever it takes to make it worth the insult of me saying that number out loud in front of you." She said it the way she'd have announced a quarterly report, flat and absolute, and yet under it, so faint I might have imagined it, the warmth of the vent shifted the air again, and this time I caught something new threaded through the black spruce and cold slate. A note almost like relief, quickly smothered. I opened my mouth to say I couldn't possibly, that I had a night shift, that people like me did not get offered corner desks by women the papers called cold enough to freeze a courtroom. Milo answered before I could. "She'll take it," he informed the coldest woman in the city, with the absolute confidence of a 5-year-old who has just successfully negotiated a peace treaty between his mother and Santa's assistant. "She says yes to things too slow. You have to help her." Rhea Castellan looked at my son the way people look at weather they didn't expect and don't yet know how to dress for. "Noted," she said, and for one unguarded second, something that was almost a smile crossed her mouth and vanished before it could commit to the shape. "Miss Calloway, welcome to Castellan Holdings." I signed paperwork I did not fully read in an office with a view of a city that had, until that morning, never once looked back at me. When we finally rode the elevator down, Milo pressed his face to the glass and watched the streets shrink beneath us, and I stood beside him smelling faintly of black spruce and cold slate on a coat that wasn't mine, wondering what exactly I had just walked into and whether it was possible to fall through a mistake and land somewhere you'd always secretly wanted to be. The 39th floor of Castellan Tower had its own weather system, and none of it was mine. I learned this on my first real day, standing in a glass-walled audit office with a temp badge clipped to a cardigan that had seen better winters, watching 4 analysts pretend not to watch me back. Word had traveled the way it does in buildings with too much ambition and not enough elevators, the mail girl. The one Miss Castellan pulled off the sorting floor because a 5-year-old wrote a letter. Nobody said it unkindly to my face. Nobody needed to. It arrived in the careful distance people kept, the way conversation stopped a half-second too late when I walked past a doorway. Only one man said anything directly, and he waited until we were alone by the coffee station to do it. "Denner Cross," he said, extending a hand I didn't particularly want to shake. "Finance VP," according to the plate on his office door I'd passed twice already. He had the kind of smile that had learned to look friendly from a manual. "Heard you used to do forensic work. Must be strange, coming from sorting envelopes to sitting at the big table." "I manage," I said. "I'm sure you do." His eyes went briefly, deliberately, to the visitor badge still clipped to my cardigan, then back up, and something in his tone shifted a half-degree colder. "Omegas usually manage. It's the thriving part that trips people up." He smiled again, like the sentence had been a compliment, and walked away before I could decide whether I'd actually heard it. I filed it under things I would not repeat to anyone who might make it worse, and went back to my desk, where the numbers, at least, did not have opinions about what I was. The gap between my apartment and Ria Castellan's world announced itself in textures, not adjectives. My building's radiator clanked twice before it gave up for the night. The tower's floors were heated from underneath, silent, so that walking across them felt like walking on something that had already decided to be kind to you. My coat had a tear in the lining I'd been meaning to fix for 2 winters. I noticed these things the way you notice a bruise. Pressing on it just to confirm it still hurt. And yet, in the middle of that enormous cold building, small warm things kept happening to me, one at a time, like someone was leaving them on purpose. The daycare that had rejected Milo twice for a waitlist suddenly had an opening the same week I started. My first paycheck arrived with a note from payroll, citing a retroactive seniority adjustment nobody could quite explain the origin of. On the coldest morning of the month, a thermos of coffee appeared at my desk before I sat down. Black, no sugar, exactly the way I drank it, though I had never told anyone in the building how I took my coffee. I mentioned it to Dee that night over the phone, pacing my kitchen while Milo colored at the table. "She's courting you," Dee said, with the flat certainty of a woman who had opinions about everyone's love life but her own. "Rich alphas don't do coffee by accident. She's my boss's boss's boss," I said. "She probably has an assistant whose entire job is knowing things like that." "Sure," Dee said, "and the daycare spot. And the seniority bump." "Ren, I love you, but you notice a decimal error from across a room and somehow you can't see a woman falling for you from 6 feet away." I told her she was being ridiculous and hung up not entirely convinced I was right. I saw Ria Castellan twice that first week, both times in passing, both times long enough for the black spruce and cold slate to reach me before she did. Steady and unhurried, nothing like the frantic, sweetened sense of the executives who scrambled to please her. The third time, she came to me. It was late, past when the audit floor usually emptied, and I was cross-referencing donor manifests against warehouse intake by hand because the system kept flagging errors I didn't yet trust myself to explain to anyone but a screen. She appeared in the doorway without announcing herself, the way people do when they're used to rooms going quiet on their behalf. "You're still here," she said. "So are you. I own the building. You have a son, who is currently asleep at Dee's because I promised I'd only be an hour, and it's been 2. I rubbed my eyes. I found something. I don't know what to do with it yet. She crossed the room and stood beside my desk, close enough that the temperature of her seemed to press against my skin like weather. She looked down at the spreadsheet, at the 300 units still unaccounted for, now joined by a second discrepancy I'd traced back through November. "Show me," she said, and pulled a chair around to my side of the desk instead of the other side, which I would later understand was, for her, an enormous concession. I walked her through it, the double-logged shipment, a vendor code that appeared nowhere else in the system, an invoice stamped and approved by someone whose signature I didn't recognize but whose title I did, Denner Cross. I didn't say his name out loud. I didn't need to. She read it herself, off the screen, and went very still in the particular way of someone deciding not to react until she was alone. "Keep this between us," she said. "For now." Why? Because if I'm wrong, I've accused a man who's worked for my family for 11 years, and if I'm right, she stopped. Her jaw did something complicated. If I'm right, I want more than 300 units before I move. Our hands were both on the desk, close enough that when she finally looked at me instead of the screen, I felt it land somewhere under my ribs I hadn't given her permission to touch. Up close, her scent was almost unbearably specific. Spruce needles crushed underfoot, the mineral cold of slate after rain, and beneath it, faint as a held breath, something warmer trying to get out. "Why me?" I asked. "You could have brought in an outside firm. Real auditors. People with badges that don't say temporary. Real auditors don't see 4 seconds of scrolling numbers and diagnose the disease," she said. "You did. In my office. With your son deciding, on my behalf, that I say yes to things too slowly." Something almost like humor moved across her face and was gone. "I don't offer second chances often, Miss Calloway." I recognized one when it walked in holding a 5-year-old's hand. I didn't have an answer for that, so I didn't try to give her one. We sat in the quiet a moment longer than the work required, close enough to share warmth, and neither of us moved first, which felt, at the time, like its own kind of answer. My phone buzzed against the desk. A text from Dee, Milo's asking if the ice lady has a castle. I laughed before I could stop myself, and Ria Castellan, close enough to see the screen, actually smiled, small and real and entirely unguarded, for exactly 1 second before she remembered herself and stood. "Go get your son," she said. "Tell him the ice lady says goodnight." I gathered my coat, my bag, the strange new warmth I didn't yet have a name for. At the elevator, Gus Vale was waiting, arms crossed, watching me with an expression I still couldn't fully place. "She doesn't sit at other people's desks," he said without preamble. "In 15 years. Maybe the chair was more comfortable on this side," I said. He almost smiled. "Almost watch yourself, Miss Calloway. Denner Cross doesn't like being seen through." I would learn, 3 days later, exactly how right he was. Denner Cross found me alone by the supply closet on the 39th floor, which I would later realize was not an accident, because Denner Cross did not believe in accidents that didn't benefit him. "You've been busy," he said, blocking the doorway with the casual weight of a man who had never once been told to move, pulling old shipment logs, asking warehouse staff questions above your pay grade. "I'm an auditor. It's the job. You're a mail clerk, miss." Castellan felt sorry for, he said, and smiled the way he always smiled, like the cruelty was a garnish and not the meal. "Let me give you some advice, since nobody else will. This company runs on people knowing which numbers are theirs to look at. You keep looking at mine, and you're going to find out how fast a temporary badge becomes a permanent unemployment." He straightened his cuffs, unhurried, certain. Omegas who forget their place tend to remember it eventually. Usually too late to matter. I did not answer him. I had spent 6 years learning that men like Denner Cross wanted a reaction more than they wanted anything true, and I was not going to hand him one in a supply closet. I walked past him, my pulse loud in my ears, and did not let my hands shake until I was alone in the stairwell. I told no one, not yet. I kept pulling threads instead, quietly. The way I used to before a layoff taught me that quiet competence could still get you fired for the crime of being inconvenient. 300 units became 600. 600 became a pattern stretching back 14 months, always the same vendor code, always signed off by the same tired signature, always timed to land during the toy drive's busiest weeks, when nobody had the hours to look twice. I was 2 folders deep into November's warehouse logs on a Thursday that had started ordinary and was rapidly becoming anything but. When Gus Vale appeared at my desk with an expression I had, by then, learned to read as trouble. "She wants you upstairs," he said. "Now, bring what you have." I brought the folder. I did not bring my coat, and would regret that within the hour, because what waited for me on the 40th floor was not simply Rhea Castellan behind her desk. It was Rhea Castellan standing at the window with her back to the door, and beside her, seated, uninvited, a man I recognized from 3 years of avoided phone calls and 1 custody hearing I'd hoped never to think about again. "Ren," Adrian said, like he had every right to be in that room, like 5 years of silence entitled him to my name in his mouth. Small city. My stomach dropped through the heated floor. "He came to my office," Rhea said, without turning around, claiming to have information relevant to a workplace concern involving you. I let him in because I wanted to hear exactly what he thought he had. She turned then, and her face had gone somewhere colder than I'd yet seen it go, a stillness that made the room's temperature feel like fact rather than metaphor. He didn't have information, he had a proposition. "Apparently my company's charity gala has made the papers curious about my staff, and Mr. Calloway here thought that curiosity might be worth a settlement, in exchange for staying quiet about being, in his words, cut out of his son's life. You abandoned us," I said to Adrian, my voice steadier than I felt. "There's no settlement for that. There's no story. You left because Milo was an Omega presenting risk on a background check for a job you wanted, and you told me so, to my face, the week he was born." Adrian had the decency, at least, to not deny it in front of an audience that could ruin him. He shifted instead toward Rhea, some old instinct for finding the more useful room to charm. "I only want what's fair," he said. "For my son." "Your son," Rhea said, "has never once mentioned your name to me, and he mentions everything." She crossed the room, and I understood, watching her, exactly how she had earned every cold word the papers had ever printed about her. I built 4 buildings on this block by knowing precisely when a man is worth listening to. "You are not." She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Security will walk you out. "If you contact Miss Calloway or her son again, or attempt to sell this fabricated custody angle to a single reporter, I will spend considerably more money proving you unfit than you were ever hoping to extract from me. Do we understand each other?" Adrian looked at me once more, something calculating and defeated moving across his face in equal measure, then let Gus Vale escort him to the elevator without another word. The door closed. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms do after violence that never quite happened. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. "You shouldn't have had to deal with that. You didn't do anything wrong." Rhea crossed back to me, closer than her usual careful distance, and for a moment I thought she might reach for my hand, and didn't, which somehow felt like more restraint than if she had. I read his file the moment Gus flagged him at the front desk. I know exactly what he did, and exactly what he didn't do for 5 years. Her jaw tightened. I don't tolerate men who think fatherhood is a bargaining chip. Why do you care this much? I asked, and it came out smaller than I meant it to, the question underneath the question. About any of this, about us. She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face slipped, just slightly. The mask cracking along a seam I hadn't known was there. 3 years ago, she said, I lost someone. My bondmate. An omega named Juno, who used to tell me control wasn't the same thing as safety, and I never believed her until it was too late to ask her to explain it again. Her voice didn't shake. It simply went very quiet, the coldest thing I'd heard from her yet, because grief that old doesn't shout, it just sits in a room and waits. My mother built this company on the idea that softness gets you buried. I believed her for 30 years. Then a boy wrote a letter about his mother's cold hands, and I read it, and something in me that I thought Juno's death had shut permanently opened again, against my better judgment. She held my gaze, unflinching, the way she held everything. That's why I care. I didn't ask to. I'm telling you anyway, because you deserve to know why the coldest woman in the city keeps finding reasons to stand this close to you. I did not have words ready for that. I had, instead, the folder in my hands, and the 600 units and Denner Cross's threats still ringing faintly in my ears. And underneath all of it, something warmer than I'd let myself feel in years, rising slow and unstoppable as a held breath finally released. I found something else today, I said, because it was the only thing steady enough to hold on to. It's worse than 300 units. I think it's closer to $2 million. Ria Castellan's expression did not change, but the temperature of the room somehow did show me everything, she said. Tonight, before he realizes how much you already know. The storm arrived the same night I laid $2 million of stolen charity money out across Ria Castellan's conference table, which felt, in retrospect, like the universe deciding one crisis at a time was no longer sufficient. The forecast had promised snow. What it delivered by 9 o'clock was something closer to a small war, wind slamming sideways against 40 floors of glass, the city below swallowed into a gray-white nothing, every road out of downtown closed within the hour. Gus Vale came in twice to report worsening conditions with the flat calm of a man who had planned for exactly this kind of night and hated that it had arrived anyway. Milo, I said, halfway through my third read of the largest falsified invoice, my stomach lurching sideways from the numbers straight into panic. He's at D's. If the road's already handled, Ria said, not looking up from the tablet in her hand. I sent a car for both of them an hour ago, before the advisory hit. They're 2 floors down in the residential suite. Dee is currently teaching my housekeeper an alarming card game. I stared at her. You had a residential suite. In your office building. I own the building, she said, as though that explained everything. Which, I supposed, it did. We worked through the numbers until close to midnight, the two of us and Gus and, eventually, Mrs. Bellwether, who arrived with cocoa nobody had asked for, and stayed to listen with the particular stillness of a woman who had worked for the Castellan family long enough to recognize a turning point when she saw one. The pattern was undeniable once laid flat. 14 months of inflated shipping invoices, duplicate vendor codes, donor pledges quietly skimmed before they ever reached warehouse manifests, all of it signed, countersigned, and buried under Denner Cross's careful, patient hand. He's been doing this since before I made VP permanent, Ria said, low, more to herself than to us, the fury in her voice banked but unmistakable. $2 million meant for children who wrote letters exactly like Milo's. We don't have enough yet for an arrest, I said. We have enough for suspicion. If he realizes we're close, he'll shred what's left and blame the discrepancy on me. I'm the newest name in this building with access to those files. It's a clean frame, and he knows it. Then we move faster than he expects. She looked at me, and for once there was no distance in it at all, only a kind of ferocious focus that made my pulse climb in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Tomorrow, the gala's final vendor reconciliation happens tomorrow. Storm or no storm. If we can match his signature to the last shell invoice before he closes the books, he can't argue his way out of it. The storm, however, had other plans. Somewhere near 1 a.m, the power flickered, held, flickered again, and died, plunging the 40th floor into a darkness broken only by the building's dim emergency lighting and the wild white static of snow against glass. Generators will kick in for the essential floors, Gus said, already moving toward the door with the calm of a man who had drilled for this. Residential suite first. I'll check on the boy. That left Rhea and me alone in an office lit only by stormlight. The tablets screen the single warm glow in the room, close enough now that I could feel the heat coming off her skin, could smell black spruce and cold slate warmed by proximity into something less like winter and more like a fire just catching. You should go check on him, she said, meaning Milo, though she didn't move to release the small space between us. Gus has it handled, I said. You said so yourself. He plans for exactly this. Neither of us moved for a long moment. The wind screamed against the window behind her, and somewhere below the city had gone dark and quiet, and in the middle of all that noise, and none of it, she reached up, slow enough that I could have stopped her, and brushed a strand of hair back from my face with a restraint that felt more intimate than if she'd simply pulled me in. Tell me to stop, she said, and I will. Don't stop, I said, and meant it more than I had meant anything in 3 cold years. She kissed me like a woman deciding, finally, to spend something she had been hoarding out of fear rather than principle, careful at first and then not. One hand at my jaw, the other braced against the desk behind me like she needed something solid to hold on to while the rest of her came undone. I felt her breath catch against my mouth, felt the low sound she made when I answered her instead of pulling away, and for one long, unmeasured stretch of time, there was no storm, no dinner cross, no $2 million. Only the two of us and the particular miracle of being wanted by someone who had spent years convincing an entire city she wanted nothing at all. When we finally broke apart, her forehead resting against mine, her breathing unsteady in a way I suspected she rarely allowed herself, she said very quietly, I don't do this. Any of this. I know, I said. I'm doing it anyway. I know that too. The lights flickered back on with a hum, fluorescent and unglamorous and entirely too honest, and we stepped apart the way people do when caught by something that isn't judging them at all. Down the hall, faintly, I heard Milo's laugh carry up through the stairwell, delighted and unbothered by the entire apocalypse of the storm, and something in my chest. Cold for 3 long years the same way Rhea's had been, cracked open a little further and let the warmth in. We found the scarred first, before we found the story. It happened 3 nights after the storm, in the quiet gap between the toy drive's final push and the gala itself, when Rhea invited Milo and me to the penthouse instead of the tower, an entire floor of glass and warm light 30 stories above a city finally digging itself out of snow. Mrs. Bellwether had made cocoa again, unprompted, and Milo had claimed the enormous window seat as his personal throne, narrating an elaborate battle between 2 of his action figures and a suspiciously important-looking paperweight he'd liberated from the coffee table. Rhea sat beside me on the couch with a stillness that had, over 3 weeks, stopped feeling like distance and started feeling like company, She had rolled her sleeves partway up against the heat of the fire, and I saw it then for the first time, a thin pale line along the inside of her forearm, old enough to have faded nearly to nothing, the kind of scar that only shows itself to people who are looking for a reason to stay. "Juno gave me this," she said, before I could ask, following my gaze without embarrassment. Not on purpose. We were sparring the year before she got sick, and she caught me because I let my guard down laughing at something she said. I never fixed it. I liked having something on my skin that proved I used to laugh. "What was she like?" I asked, gently, because it felt like the kind of question you only get to ask once, and I wanted to ask it right. "Loud," Rhea said, and something in her face softened into memory. "Impossible." She used to say my mother's whole doctrine was a coward's excuse for never being disappointed in anyone, because if you never let people close enough to matter, they could never let you down. She turned her cup slowly in her hands. She was right, and I hated her for being right. And I loved her more than I have ever loved anything before or since, until she stopped, glancing toward the window seat, toward the small boy narrating an epic in miniature. Until recently, I didn't say anything. I let the fire fill the silence, and after a moment, she kept going, because grief, once it finds a door left open, tends to walk all the way through. She got sick fast. 8 months. My mother told me not to let the company see me grieve, because grief was a currency I couldn't afford to spend in public. So I didn't. I came back to work 11 days after the funeral, and I have not cried where anyone could see me since. Her voice, for the first time, had a crack in it, hairline, and honest. I built an entire company on the theory that control was the only thing that couldn't be taken from me. It turns out it was the only thing I ever had left, and it isn't worth what it cost. "It's not a weakness," I said, "that you loved her enough to still be this careful." "I know that now," she said, and looked at me in a way that made the whole apartment feel smaller and warmer at once. I didn't, until a boy wrote a letter about his mother's cold hands, and a woman who used to be an accountant walked into my office and looked at me like I was a person instead of a headline. I told her mine, then, because it seemed only fair. The layoff dressed as a restructuring. The manager who'd smiled while doing it, calling it a difficult but necessary decision, as though difficult belonged to him and not to me. Adrian's silence, and then his sudden greedy noise the moment my name touched money. The years of Haverford's stapler voice reminding me, twice a shift, exactly how replaceable I was. "I used to be good at something," I said, "really good, and for 5 years I let people convince me that motherhood had erased that, instead of just moving it to the side for a while." I looked at Milo, still narrating, entirely unaware he was the reason 2 grown women were quietly rebuilding themselves in his general direction. He's the reason I kept getting up every night for a job that hurt my hands. I never once regretted him. I regretted every person who made me feel like I had to choose between being his mother and being someone worth noticing. "You were always worth noticing," Rhea said, low, certain, the words landing with the weight of a verdict rather than a compliment. I just happened to be paying attention when the mail finally proved it. Milo abandoned his battle scene without warning and climbed up between us on the couch, entirely uninvited, entirely certain of his welcome, dragging half a blanket with him. "Are you going to marry my mom?" he asked Rhea, with the devastating bluntness only a 5-year-old can deploy without consequence. "Milo," I said, mortified. "I'm asking questions," he said. "It's allowed." Rhea looked at him and then at me, and something in her face went entirely, unguardedly warm, the coldest woman in the city undone by a boy in reindeer pajamas. Ask me again in a few months, she told him gravely, as though negotiating a merger. I intend to earn the answer first. Milo considered this an acceptable term and went back to his battle, and I sat there between the fire and the window and the enormous, terrifying tenderness of being chosen, and let myself, for the first time in years, believe that this particular warmth might be allowed to last. It lasted 4 days. On the 5th, I walked into the audit floor to find every head turned toward a laptop propped open on the break room counter, and a headline glowing across the screen that made my stomach drop straight through the heated floor: Castellan CEO's mailroom romance linked to missing charity funds. The article was careful in the way only real damage manages to be, technically accurate in its smallest details and devastating in its arrangement of them. A temporary employee, recently promoted under unusual circumstances directly by the CEO. Access to sensitive shipping and donor records. An unexplained $2 million discrepancy in the toy drive's charitable accounts, now, conveniently, surfacing the same week her promotion became public. An anonymous source close to the finance department quoted extensively, expressing concern about favoritism, oversight, and whether Ms. Castellan's personal interest in her new hire had compromised the company's judgment. I didn't need to guess who the anonymous source was. I could still hear Denner Cross's voice in the supply closet, promising me exactly this. By noon, security had escorted me to a conference room for what Gus Vale, grim-faced and apologetic, called a routine internal review, which was, corporate language for you are the most convenient person to blame. By 1, a reporter had found Dee's building and was asking neighbors about the mail girl and her boss. By 2, my phone would not stop ringing with numbers I didn't recognize. And 1, chillingly, that I did, Adrian, texting a single line that made my hands go cold. Saw the news. Custody lawyers love headlines like this one. Call me before I call mine. I sat in that conference room for 3 hours while lawyers I'd never met asked me questions in careful, unaccusing tones that accused me anyway, and somewhere on the other side of the building, I knew. Ria Castellan was doing the one thing her mother's doctrine had trained her to do better than anyone alive, going cold. In public, to protect the company, because that was the doctrine, and because grief that old doesn't unlearn its instincts overnight, even when it wants to. She did not come to the conference room. I told myself it was strategy, that a public defense from her would only confirm the story's premise, that Gus's careful silence on her behalf meant something other than what it felt like. I told myself a great many things in that room, and none of them stopped the particular cold that settled into my chest when, at 4 o'clock, a memo went out company-wide, under her name, placing me on administrative leave pending review. I picked Milo up from daycare with my hands shaking too badly to fasten his coat properly and found 2 reporters camped outside our building. Cameras raised, calling my name like they had any right to it, asking questions about money and romance and my son in the same breath, until Dee came down the stairs in her bathrobe and told them, with a fury that would have made me laugh on any other day, exactly where they could point their cameras instead. Inside, Milo sat very still on the couch, his reindeer sweater pulled tight around him, watching me with the particular seriousness of a child who understands more than adults ever give them credit for. "Are we in trouble?" he asked. "Because of my letter." "No," I said, kneeling in front of him, my voice cracking on a word that should have been easy. "None of this is because of your letter. None of this is your fault. Or mine. Is Ria still my friend?" I did not have an answer for him. I had a company memo with her name on it, and a headline with our names tangled together like an accusation, and a silence from the 40th floor that felt, in that moment, exactly like the worst thing that had happened to us yet, Worse than Adrian, worse than Denner Cross's threats, worse than any cold room I had ever sorted mail in, because it meant that the one place I had let myself believe was warm might have been, after all, just another kind of winter waiting to close over both of us. I did not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with every scrap of evidence I'd gathered spread out under a single lamp, because if the world had decided I was the villain of this story, I intended to hand it the actual one instead. By morning, I had built a timeline instead of a defense. 14 months of shell invoices. A vendor code that traced through 3 shell companies Denner Cross had clearly assumed no one temporary enough to be disposable would ever bother unwinding, back to a numbered account that, according to a filing D's cousin at the county clerk's office, pulled for me before dawn, belonged to Denner Cross's brother-in-law. I found the anonymous quote from the article matched its phrasing against an internal memo Denner had sent 2 months earlier, and the language lined up close enough to leave no real doubt who had planted the story to bury his own theft under my name. What I did not have was access. My badge had been suspended the moment the memo went out. Gus Vale solved that problem by arriving at my door at 7 in the morning, unshaven, grim, holding a temporary credential and an expression that told me he had spent the night doing exactly what I had. "She didn't write that memo willingly," he said, before I could ask. "The board forced it first thing, while she was still finding out what happened same as the rest of us. She's been in that building for 18 hours straight, tearing the finance department apart looking for the same thing you're looking for." He held the door for me like a man done waiting for permission. "She took a hit for you already, Miss Calloway. Board wanted her to fire you outright. She refused in a room full of people who don't like being refused. And told them she'd resign before she signed your termination. That's not nothing. From her." I went. I brought Milo to Dee's, kissed his forehead, promised him it would be over soon in the specific tone parents use when they aren't entirely sure they're telling the truth, and rode the elevator to the 40th floor with the timeline clutched in a folder against my chest like armor. Ria Castellan looked like she hadn't slept either, hair loose from its usual severe pull, sleeves shoved up, standing over a conference table buried in the same shipping records I'd spent weeks memorizing. She looked up when I entered, and whatever cold the memo had put between us broke apart in an instant, replaced by something raw and relieved and furious all at once. "I didn't believe a word of it," she said, before I could speak. "I want you to know that. Not for 1 second. "I know," I said, and found, to my own surprise, that I did. "I brought you the rest of it." We laid it out together, my timeline against her financial audit, the shell company against the brother-in-law's account, the leaked quote against the internal memo, until the picture was no longer suspicion, but evidence, complete and damning, $2 million and a smear campaign, both traced to the same careful, contemptuous hand. "He's presenting the gala's final numbers to the full board and half the city's press in 6 hours, Ria said. Low. Dangerous. The coldest woman in the city finally, entirely, done being cold on someone else's behalf. He thinks he's closing the books clean. I intend to let him open his mouth first. He'll deny everything the moment he sees us coming, I said. We need him to say it himself, on record, before he knows we have the account trail." Gus Vale, arms crossed by the door, allowed himself something close to a smile. "Then let's make sure the recording's already running before he opens that mouth of his." Ria looked at me, and for one unguarded moment beneath all that fury, something gentler moved through her expression, gratitude, and something warmer besides. "Whatever happens in that room," she said, "I want you standing in it. Not hiding at home, waiting to hear how it went. You built this case. You should be the one who ends it." "Then let's go end it," I said. And for the first time since the headline broke, I felt something in my chest unclench, the cold finally starting to give way to something with heat enough to fight back. The gala ballroom on the ground floor of Castellan Tower had been decorated for the toy drive for weeks, garlands strung across 60-foot ceilings, a tree glittering near the stage tall enough to need its own permit, and under all that manufactured warmth, 300 donors, board members, and reporters settled into rows of chairs to watch a man about to lose everything explain, on camera, exactly how he'd stolen it. Denner Cross took the podium at 6 o'clock precisely, in a suit that had clearly been chosen for photographs, and began his remarks on the season's charitable success with the easy confidence of a man who believed the worst was already behind him. This year's toy drive delivered a record number of gifts to children across the city, he said, gesturing at a slide behind him full of cheerful, rounded numbers, despite what I'll call an unfortunate distraction in recent press coverage regarding certain irregularities in donor accounting. I want to reassure everyone in this room that those concerns have been thoroughly reviewed, and the responsible party has already been identified and removed from this organization. He did not look at me. He didn't need to. Half the room already had. Rhea let him finish. She let the applause start, thin and uncertain, before she rose from her seat at the front table and walked to the podium herself, unhurried, the way she did everything, and the room's noise died the moment she reached the microphone. "Before we move to the evening's toy count," she said, "I'd like to correct the record Mr. Cross just gave you." She nodded once toward the sound booth and the enormous screen behind the stage, which had been showing cheerful donor totals moments before, switched instead to a spreadsheet, 14 months of shipping invoices laid bare in red, tracing a single vendor code through 3 shell companies to a numbered account. "This account," Rhea said, "belongs to Marcus DL, Mr. Cross's brother-in-law. It has received $2,140,000 in charitable donations meant for children's gifts, funneled through inflated shipping invoices Mr. Cross personally approved over 14 months while my company publicly celebrated record generosity." Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. The room had gone silent enough to hear a pin, let alone an accusation this precise. The employee he named as responsible, Wren Calloway, is in fact the person who uncovered this. She did it in 3 weeks, with no formal access, no support staff, and considerably more integrity than the man who just tried to bury her under his own crime. Denner Cross's face went through several colors in quick succession, landing finally on the particular white of a man realizing the exits have already closed. "This is a fabrication," he said. "A coordinated attack, clearly, by someone whose judgment is compromised by a personal relationship with—" "I have his signature," Rhea said, calm and final, on 11 separate falsified invoices, and a recording, made 15 minutes ago in his own office, of him instructing his assistant to destroy the remaining paper trail before tonight's gala. She let that sit in the silence for exactly as long as it needed to. "Security is waiting outside this ballroom. The board has already been briefed. Whatever you say next, Mr. Cross, I'd recommend it be to your lawyer." The room erupted, not into applause, but into the low roar of 300 people simultaneously understanding they had just watched a man's career end in real time. Cameras swung toward Denner Cross as security moved in from the side doors, and I watched him look for someone, anyone, to blame that wasn't himself. His eyes finally landing on me across the ballroom with a hatred so plain it should have frightened me, and somehow, standing there with the truth finally laid bare under Christmas lights, didn't. Rhea stepped back from the podium, found me in the crowd, and crossed the entire ballroom floor to reach me, in front of the board, the donors, every camera in the room. "I owe you a public correction," she said, loud enough to carry, and an apology I should have made the moment that memo went out. Her hand found mine, warm despite everything, black spruce and cold slate closer now than any careful distance had ever allowed in public. Wren Calloway is not a distraction from this company's integrity. She is the only reason it still has any. I don't remember deciding to kiss her in front of 300 witnesses and every camera the press had brought. I remember only that the cold finally, entirely, broke, and the whole glittering ballroom erupted into something that sounded, for once, exactly like the warmth it was supposed to represent all along. Denner Cross was in a police car within the hour, and by the time the ballroom's chaos began to settle into something like celebration, I found Rhea near the enormous toy drive tree, watching the last of the reporters file out with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, something unguarded all the way through. "He'll try to make a deal," she said. "Name the brother-in-law, maybe others, in exchange for a lighter sentence. I intend to let the prosecutors decide that, not me." "You could have buried him tonight," I said. "Completely. You had the room." "I know." She looked at me, and something in her face softened further, the last of the doctrine finally letting go. "I almost did. And then I thought about what you'd think of me if I did it just to prove I could." She reached for my hand again, steadier this time, certain. "You're the reason I stopped an inch short of becoming exactly what my mother raised me to be. I'd like that to keep being true." Behind us, half hidden by the enormous tree, Milo appeared in his good sweater, having apparently talked Dee into letting him attend after all, and marched directly up to Rhea with the gravity of a boy closing a long-negotiated deal. "Did you catch the bad guy?" he asked. "We did," Rhea said. "Good," Milo said. "Now can you marry my mom?" Rhea looked at me, laughing for the first time that night, warm and unguarded and entirely undone, and I understood, watching her, that whatever winter she had lived in for 3 long years had finally, completely thawed. Rhea proposed on Christmas Eve, in the one place I'd least expected her sentiment to show itself, the 4th Street Annex sorting room, closed for the holiday. Cold and empty, except for the conveyor belt where I'd once knelt fishing a torn glove out from under Haverford's stapler voice. "I wanted you to see it end here," she said, standing in the middle of the room she'd had Gus arrange lights through, the whole space transformed with garlands and a single warm lamp where the supervisor's desk used to be. The place where the mistake started. I thought it deserved to also be the place where I stopped calling it one. She knelt, which the papers, when the photo eventually surfaced, would call the single, softest image the coldest woman in the city had ever allowed to exist. The box she opened held a ring set with a small dark stone, cut plain, unshowy, exactly like her. "I don't do this easily," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. "I loved once and lost it, and I told myself for 3 years that control was the only thing that couldn't be taken from me. Then a boy wrote a letter about his mother's cold hands, and I have not been in control of a single thing since, and it turns out that's the safest I've ever felt." She looked up at me, unguarded all the way through. "Marry me, Wren. Let me spend the rest of whatever this is making sure neither of you is ever cold again." "Yes," I said, before she'd even finished the sentence, and Milo, who had been helping arrange the lights and was in fact the one who'd insisted on this exact room, cheered loud enough to echo off the empty conveyor belts. We married the following December, 1 year to the week after a smudged zip code changed everything, in the Castellan Tower ballroom under the same enormous tree. Though this time, the toy drive numbers on the screen behind us were honest ones, verified twice, distributed in full. Mrs. Bellwether cried through the entire ceremony and denied it after. Gus Vale, who had not smiled once in 15 years according to every account but mine, smiled twice and told anyone who'd listen that he'd never seen his employer wait for anyone until the day Wren Calloway walked in holding a 5-year-old's hand, and that he intended to remind her of it at every anniversary going forward as a professional courtesy. Our vows were short, because Rhea did not believe in wasting words she meant. "I will always find the light on," she said, the promise she'd made me quietly months earlier, tested through every dark hour since, and never once broken. Whatever the weather, whatever the cost, the light stays on. "Someone is always listening," I answered, the promise I had made my son every Christmas of his life, tested and proven true in a way I'd never dared hope for, even when it doesn't look like it. I believed that for Milo's sake. I believe it completely now for mine. We bonded that night, in private, the way the ceremony of it deserved, her mouth at my throat asking permission with the same careful restraint she'd shown from the very beginning, gentle even in the moment instinct pressed hardest against her control, and when I said yes, said it again, said it a third time just to feel her breath catch against my skin at the sound of it, the bite that followed felt less like being claimed and more like, finally, completely, being found. A year later, on a morning bright with fresh snow, I stood at the window of a penthouse that had somehow, gradually, become simply home, watching Milo build something enormous and structurally improbable out of snow on the terrace below, while Rhea supervised with the grave seriousness of a woman who had once run 4 buildings and now considered snow forts an equally important operation. Denner Cross was 3 months into a federal sentence, his brother-in-law's account seized and returned, dollar for dollar, to the toy drive fund he'd bled for over a year. Mr. Haverford, we'd heard through D, had lost his supervisor position after the same audit that caught Denner turned up a decade of safety violations at the annex he'd been too busy bullying temps to fix. He wrote me an email once, awkward and unapologetic, that I did not answer, because some cruelties don't earn a reply, only consequences, and his had finally arrived without my help. Milo had taken to calling Rhea Mama Rhea sometime in the spring, the transition so gradual none of us marked the exact day it happened, only noticed one afternoon that it had simply always been true. He'd asked over dinner a few weeks back, with the same devastating directness that had once negotiated our entire future in a stranger's office, whether he might get a baby brother or sister someday. And Rhea had looked at me over his head with an expression I recognized now as pure, undefended hope, and said only, someday, when your mother says the word. On the wall by our front door hung a small frame, unremarkable except for what it held, a piece of red construction paper, folded once, taped shut with a snowman sticker that had long since lost its stick, the crayon inside faded, but still legible if you looked closely enough to find it. Please make my mom's hands stop hurting from the cold room she works in, and please make someone see her the way I do. Rhea touched it every morning on her way out the door, a habit she never explained, and I never asked her to. Outside, Milo's snow fort finally collapsed under its own ambition, and his delighted shriek of laughter carried up through the glass. And Rhea looked back at me from the terrace with snow melting in her dark hair and something soft and certain in her face that the whole city would have called impossible a year before. Some mistakes are simply love arriving by the wrong address. A letter meant for the North Pole finds instead the coldest woman in the city, and somewhere in that error, in that small crooked accident of a smudged zip code, 2 people who had both stopped expecting to be seen finally were. The warmest things rarely announce themselves as anything but a mistake at first. It only takes someone willing to read past the address to find out they were exactly where they were always meant to arrive. The end.